May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. It's an honor to be with you. As John mentioned, I am a priest in the Diocese of New Hampshire. I know Lyndon and Reed from many years ago. Hi, Lyndon. Nice to see you. It's just wonderful to be back in church. I'm building a house with my wife, so I'm not serving a parish at the moment. So if I'm a little bit rusty, it's just because I am. So thank you. I want to begin with a question for you all. And it's a question about planning. I'm wondering what you're planning for these days. If you're anything like me, sort of at the surface level, you're planning for the holidays. There's the Thanksgiving meal to figure out, and the maybe easy, maybe complicated dynamics of who you invite and who you spend the day with. Where your kids will take a nap when you eat at 3 o'clock can be a very complicated thing as someone with a toddler and a newborn. These are, difficult things to plan for, but not impossible. But I want to invite you to zoom out a little bit and ask you again, what are you planning for? If you think of your life as a timeline from birth until death, we don't know exactly where we are, of course, but some of us probably imagine that we're somewhere in the middle and we're planning for how to pay for our kids' education, maybe beginning to think about retirement or regretting that we didn't think about it earlier. For those of you in the second half of life, maybe you're thinking about the end of your days, how to end well, if there's forgiveness that you need to extend or receive, if there are things you need to clear out of your home or nursing care. These are all complicated things to plan for, more complicated than what's for Thanksgiving, but they're not impossible. But I want you to zoom out one more time and think about your life, not just on the timeline of your birth and death, but creation and what Jesus talks about as the end of the age to come. And to see your life as just a little snippet in that timeline. So when you really zoom out to look at the cosmic picture, I wonder what you're planning for. So many of today's readings from Zephaniah, from Thessalonians, that is the concern of the writers. They're concerned with the age to come. So what do you think about, how do we plan for this mysterious time, which seems to be written about mostly in metaphor and poetry, which we can only point to? That is really complicated planning. But if you're a Christian, it's really, really important planning. So if you're stumped by that question, know you're in good company, because the disciples were stumped by that question too. That's the context for today's gospel reading. I asked a friend who leads a midweek Bible study if they focused on today's gospel reading, and he said that they did, and he said he hates it. I asked him why, and he said some of the things that maybe you don't like about it either: the slavery metaphors, the seeming cruelty of the master. That third slave seems like he gets a pretty raw deal. It all seems a little cruel. I actually think the story is really, really important if we know a little bit more about the context. So the disciples are sitting with Jesus on the Mount of Olives. It's Holy Week when this story takes place. Jesus knows he's about to die. The disciples knows he's about to die. And I can't help but wonder if Jesus is thinking about how they will stay together and how his message will continue after his death. And I can only imagine the grief and terror that is on the disciples' heart as they think about what their life will look like this when their leader is gone. They're all from Galilee. They're in a foreign city in Jerusalem, or at least a distant city. And they've given their lives for this man who's now about to die. And so they're wondering, what do we do? And on top of that, he's begun teaching that there's an age to come and that he'll return. So you can only imagine that they're incredibly curious, not just intellectually, but on a deep level. What does this mean for us that Jesus is going to die and disappear and come back? And so of all the things Jesus could have told them, he tells one of the things he tells them, because this parable is actually one of three parables he speaks. He tells them this story. Now, there's a lot I could say about the story, but I just want to zoom in to verse 25. And in that line, it says, it's where the third slave says that he was afraid and he went and hid his talent. And it's that one confession, that one act distinguishes that third slave and his fate from the other two. I was afraid and I went and hid your talent. The first two slaves boldly invested what the master gave them. The third slave was afraid, and it's for that very reason that he gets such disapproval from the master. Jesus' words seem harsh, but I also wonder if he couldn't foresee all the hardships that were ahead of the disciples in his absence. After all, only one of the 12 disciples was not martyred. The other 11 all were killed for their faith. And so I have to think Jesus was incredibly concerned that fear would paralyze and overtake the disciples. And so his message in the parable is this: be bold, be not afraid, take courage. It's a simple and a beautiful message, and I confess, as someone who struggles with anxiety, it's also a little bit hard to hear, because when you feel afraid, it really isn't very helpful to be told, be not afraid. Not great advice. So what do we do with that? This wisdom that's clearly true, but perhaps hard to hear. There are lots of things I could talk about, but the one practice that called to me on this day was the practice of studying the lives of the saints. And the reason it stood out was because in Thessalonians, Paul says to encourage one another and build one another up. He doesn't give the Thessalonians, who are also wondering about this age to come, he doesn't give them a detailed vision of what's going to happen. He just says, you don't know when it will come. And so in the meantime, build and encourage one another up. I've been praying morning prayer online at 6 a.m. For the last few years, but only recently online. It's something that you all are welcome to attend. I can share more about it later. But one of the ways that's transformed me is I'm reading the lives of the saints daily. And I realize that the people who are there to encourage me and to build me up are not just the people in church with me or even the people in the diocese, but there's a whole cloud of witnesses across time and space who are rooting for me, who are cheering me on, and in whose debt I live. And I know that, I say this as a congregational convert, that there's deep wisdom in the Episcopal tradition, recognizing that there's these incredible examples of people who can inspire us. So I want to just read one such person. Her name is Elizabeth, Princess of Hungary. She is the saint for today, November 19th. And I share this in case you feel inspired to pick up a copy of the Episcopal Book of Saints. It's called Lesser Feasts and Fasts. So this is a little snippet of Elizabeth's life. Elizabeth's charity is remembered in numerous hospitals that bear her name throughout the world. She was born in 1207 at Pressburg Hungary, daughter of King Andrew II of Hungary, and she was married in 1221 at age 14 to Louis IV, Landgrave of Thuringia, to whom she bore 3 children. At an early age, she showed concern for the poor and the sick, and was thus attracted to the Franciscans who came to her city in 1223. From them, she received spiritual direction. Her husband was sympathetic to her almsgiving and allowed her to use her dowry for this purpose. During a famine and epidemic in 1226, when her husband was in Italy, she sold her jewels and established a hospital where she cared for the sick and the poor. To supply their needs, she opened the royal granaries. And after her husband's death in 1227, the opposition of the court to her extravagances, quote unquote, compelled her to leave the city with her children. For some time, she lived in great distress. She then courageously took the habit of the Franciscans, the first order of the Franciscan tertiaries, or third order in Germany. Finally, arrangements with her family gave her a subsistence, and she spent her remaining years in Marburg, living in self-denial, caring for the sick and needy. She died from exhaustion November 6, 1231, and was canonized by Pope Gregory IX 4 years later. What an amazing woman. A mother of 3, married at 14, someone who lived only into her 20s, and who was both royalty and had an incredible heart for the poor, and set up hospitals and used all within her means to care for the sick and needy. So I think this is the good news from today, as hard as the passages may be to hear. The good news as you zoom out on the timeline of your life and look not just at your 80 years, God willing, there, or more or less, but at all of cosmic time, that you don't need to put all your energy into worrying about what is to come, but you can put your energy into building up one another, and know at the same time that there's a cloud of witnesses across time and space who are cheering you on, interceding to God on your behalf, and just deeply desire for you to live lives with as open-hearted and as beautiful as theirs. Amen.